We're here to talk to you about the creative and technical challenges we faced during the production of the 6-part TV series Good Omens, and also how we leverage the cloud throughout the entire production to be able to render the 650 shots required for the project. So first, a few words about Milk. So we are a studio located in London. We have a capacity for 250 artists. We started up in 2013, and the last 6 years we've been quite busy working on a variety of different shows ranging from high-end TV series to feature films and occasionally on some special venue projects. So you can see on the screen some of the examples of our latest work, such as Altered Carbon, Adrift, and Good Omens, which will be the focus of today's talk. So before Adrian talks to you about the creative challenges of the project, let's have a look at some of the examples of our latest work in our latest showreel.
Hi everyone. So as Benoit mentioned, I was a CG supervisor on Good Omens, and what my talk's going to be about is a little bit about what Good Omens is and its origin, the range of VFX that we created at Milk, and a little bit of insight into the methodologies and workflows that we adopted to create some of the assets, and just generally how our pipeline evolved over time to make full use of Amazon's cloud. So what is Good Omens? Good Omens was a book originally written by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman back in the 1990s. And it's a story about an angel, played by Michael Sheen, and a demon, played by David Tennant, and how their friendship evolves over time for them to help prevent the apocalypse and the end of the world. One of the key themes throughout the show is that the Satan's son, who's reborn as a small child, everything that he imagines comes to life. So many of our effects and the work that we created is quite fantasy-based in nature. The scope of VFX needed. So Milk was a principal vendor for Good Omens. We ended up creating about 650 VFX shots throughout the time. And that was spanning from anything from like full CG creatures, environments, set extensions, feature replacements on actors, and a whole other range of fantastical VFX. Our approach for the creation. So it was really important to us that we worked closely with Neil and Douglas throughout the entire of the show, from pre-production to post-production and shot creation. And it was important that the CG elements didn't really stand out too much and weren't too in your face. Neil, the show creator, and Douglas McKinnon, the director, was heavily focused on that we maintain the style of it and maintain this true nature of the book's narrative. So what I'm going to do for you now is just play a little bit of a behind-the-scenes breakdown reel of just some of the stuff we made. Not all of it, because we'd be here for quite a few hours. But yeah, so I hope you enjoy this.
Yes, it did. Didn't have a reaction to yours, mate.
First offensive, right? I can't see what's so bad about knowing the difference between good and evil anyway.
You've lost the boy.
We've lost.
So as you saw, we created a whole variety of digital creatures and monsters for the show. And one of them that featured was the Hellhound. And again, this was, we had to do a full CG head replacement for this. We filmed the practical dog on set. And then the brief was that this needed to be a Hellhound who was Satan's son's like guardian protector, like his own personal pet. So we came up with the concept and we designed these, recreated the face and gouged out the eyes. And one of the things we had to maintain was we made sure that we had to pay close attention to how we did the groom direction and make sure that the subsurface was right on the teeth, the ears, and it all matched up tonally wise. Another one was the Usher. This was one of my personal favorites just because of the actual personality and character he had on the show. And he was only in a small part of the show, but the best part was that we had full creative freedom to do what we want to do. So everything from concept design to Lookdev to even adding the assets, they were like, you have full range, so make something nice. So we showed them this and they were like, yep, that's it, that's what we want. He's going in. Then we had the snake. This was David Tennant Crowley. This was his original form in the opening sequence of the show in the Garden of Eden section. And the brief was that this snake needed to be big and menacing in size, relating to an anaconda, but the actual look was more of a black mamba, the red-bellied black mamba, just because it stayed true to Crowley's theme throughout the show, which is like red and black. style design. And then we have Satan himself. We did go through quite a few design iterations for him, as, again, he was in one of the main big impact sequence of the show, but he was only in one part of the show. So we need to make sure and we focused on creating this menacing look for his design and his overall look. Then we had our digital environments, which were both full CG, interior and exterior. One of them was Heaven. Again, as you saw in the breakdown reel, this was a full CG build, full complete replacement. And one of the things that we had that was in the brief was that their perception of Heaven was we were looking out and seeing everything at once. So we had to do a full 360 panorama that incorporated all the different landmarks and historical landmarks throughout the major cities in the world and really encompass that so they could see it all at once. The brief was, it was more of an architectural, clean, minimalistic style, and that's the kind of look that we were going through. And it was important to know that I think one of the buildings in London called the Sky Garden, I don't know if you've heard of it, if you're up there at the very top, you get a full 360 of London. So we really had to push that design and that aspect of it in our creation. One of them was the Forest Penthouse. This was one of the characters' childhood homes in the TV series. And again, as you saw in the breakdown, this was shot on location in South Africa. And the brief was that, this was the only house, the only building in that entire section. So we had to replace everything from foreground, background, even to the look of the mountain behind it. This probably ended up being around about probably over 1,000 trees that was exported in Maya as asses. And then we rendered those. So the scene was pretty light, but even though we had like probably over 1,000 trees at once, it was quite a feat to get through. And they were all hand-placed by our 3D team, just to let you know. So no proceduralness going on there. Then we had our Soho Street. Again, this was a practical set that was built and filmed, and loads of green screen cards everywhere. And then we had to go through and recreate everything from CG buildings, lights, street props, signs, even cars as well, and digidouble as well. We didn't use any crowd in this for this. They were all animated digidoubles, which was pretty. We had a small animation team at the time, but they were happy to do it, so they were fine. And then we also had to make sure in our Lookdev stage that it worked through a variety of different lighting environments. So obviously nighttime, daytime, and overcast. Then we had our digital wing extensions. And again, wings and furry creatures is something we have done at Milk before, but never to this scale, where you would have two hero wings. So we really need to focus on the actual look and design and pay, both in the pre-production stages, make sure we developed a system where we could fulfill this need and fulfill this nature and the look of it. But I'll come back to that more on, later on in the talk. And then we had some complex effect simulations. The amount of effects work needed for Good Omens was pretty big when we saw the initial brief. And for this show alone, we had about probably 10 plus effects artists working for all 6 shots. And you consider that, we've probably got multiple shows going on throughout the studio. So to have one show with 10 effects artists was pretty greedy of us. One of the ones we had to create was the M25. That's a highway or motorway that runs around the outside of London. And the brief was that in one part of the show, it gets set on fire, and it has this big, massive wall of fire. And the design look was it needed to be related to a napalm-style explosion, but that was continuously flowing. So that was looping. So one of the tricks was our effects team had a bit of R&D time to make sure they set up a tool that we could do that, so we could have something that large scale on screen, but still maintain that fluidity and the flow to make sure you actually really set the scale. Again, you saw the Bentley. We had to do a full CG replacement for this, for some of the takeover shots. And the brief was in this that, again, in the second half of the show, David Tennant's character, Crowley, he's seen driving this around in London. And in the story, the car moved about 200 miles per hour. So our effects team, again, had to design a tool and a setup inside Houdini where we could maintain the flow of the car but have artistic creation over it. And if the director said, the flames are moving too quick or too fast, we could dial it down and make it slower, but still maintain the speed that it was traveling throughout the shots. Then we had our Kraken. This guy, again, was another personal favorite of mine just because of how he ended up looking in some of the final shots. And unfortunately, again, he was only in 3 shots, 2 of them being tentacle shots. But again, what was fun about this is we worked on a show previously called Adrift. So we reused that pipeline of doing wave simulations and wakes and ocean sprays and those kind of things and really developed that tool and reused it again for this. And the hybrid was, we rendered most of those effects in Mantra and rendered those out, and then the actual Kraken itself was rendered in Maya with Arnold And then we kind of combined them two with deep compositing just to make sure it all sat together nicely. And then we had our Satan character. Again, so fortunately for this, he was at the end of the show. So throughout all the stuff that we learned through the other 5 episodes of Good Omens, we really put all that work in R&D stage into doing his final emergence and choreographing that really nicely. But again, I'll come back to that later. So what I'm going to do now is talk about the 2 bigger challenges that we faced on Good Omens, and just where, even though we used the cloud throughout the show, we really had to manage our resources and balance it between these 2 aspects of the show. So one of them was the ring creation. So as mentioned before, we have done feathers and creatures at Milk before, but this particular thing was a nice little technical challenge, both creatively and technically for us at Milk, and we had to make sure that we maintained a balance between those 2 earlier on in the stages. The designs were based around a swung wing, which was one of our approved original concepts. And initially we went and we modeled each wing individually, the main ones, the primaries, secondaries, and then we gave that as a template to our groom team, and for that they used Yeti exclusively for that. We decided to go with a full feather solution just because we felt that it gave us enough flexibility and it still maintained the quality and the amount of detail that we needed for the wings. We tried other methods, but they didn't really hold up when we did our tests. Once that was done, we handed it over to our rigging and animation team. And what was important for us was that we needed to make sure that in the initial part of the show, the wings were in a folded up state. So we needed to pay close attention to how we eradicated some of the problems with the intersections and the folding. And we really need to pay close attention to that on a rigging stage. When it came to shot production, it was kind of a back and forth between animation, rigging, the groom team as well, just to make sure that everything was balanced. Because in some experts, when the wings were full out, they were fine because they were outsprayed. But when they were tucked in, we noticed there was quite a lot of technical and visual imperfections. So we needed to make sure that was balanced and ironed out. And it was just a back and forth between those generally. So the look development part, we decided to go for a full shader-based solution for this. So we didn't do any hand-painted textures for the wings. And this was just so that we could have complete control of the variations, the hues, and the tones of the feathers, and make sure no 2 feather was the same. What we found out about doing painted textures is that if we wanted to change the look or a particular color change or color correction of the wings, we had to go all the way back to texturing and then pass that back through the pipeline. So we decided to keep it at shader level, so therefore if the lighter needed to make any changes on the fly, they could do that without coming out of the pipeline and going back into the full range. So one of the problems, or one of the more or less technical challenges we had to face was with the black wings. We had to pay a close attention to the detail that was needed. They are black, but you still need to retain that sort of aspect of the sheen and the iridescence. And we paid close attention to crow's wings and how they behaved, and as well as raven wings and how they reflected and they moved around in light. And getting that right balance of the iridescence and sheen was very important for us. We didn't really want to have it too overbearing, but we wanted enough subtlety so we could tell the difference that way. And then the white wings. One of the challenges was that obviously white feathers are quite white, so we needed to make sure they had enough subsurfacing and enough light scattering and absorption in the wings, just give them the full fluffiness and make sure it actually really held up at that close stage on screen. Some of the technical challenges of the wings that we had. Once we had enough detail and we were happy with the overall look, it was important to us to make sure we retain that quality. But one of the things, one of the bottlenecks we ran into was that any one time on the screen, one wing would probably end up being about 11 million curves for the Yeti feather approach that we took on. So you imagine 11 million individual curves rendering. One export was probably about 5 gigs, so you times that by 4, and then you add in all the complications of the shaders and the transparency, and you layering it up, and it probably ended up being, I'm rendering at 4K, sorry, I might add. Some of the render times were probably about 4 to 5 hours for a mid-range shot, and then probably even doubling that when we came up to the close-range shots. All the close-range shots of the wings were up in episode 1, and then we kind of got a little bit of a break in episode 6 where they were more mid-range. And one of our approaches that we have at Milk was our rendering pipeline is more or less, well, I say more or less, we like to stick to probably about 20% local rendering and 80% rendering in a farm. And this was just because we needed to make sure that when rendering these, because there's such a big bottleneck of the time we needed, the cloud really helped us to render these out and get them out. Another one was Satan, our hero, well, one of our big creatures. And again, in past shows, we have done creatures at Milk before, but it was to make something this huge and how much effects he needed in his overall entrance. It was another tricky challenge, but welcomed at Milk. Some of our first concepts of him were quite horror-focused and scary, but Neil really wanted to strip that back and really make sure that he was more recognizable as Satan initially. So you didn't see him on stage and think, what kind of demon is that? You want to see him and say, right, okay, that is Satan. That's our main guy. We really want to capture that presence. So we spent a lot of time in the sculpt stage to really capture all these detail. And we ended up doing a mixture of sometimes probably 4 to 8K maps, just for the really close-up shots. We wanted to capture all that detail. And as you can see from here, we use ZBrush, but we also made use of another software called Chronobo. And this handled all of the micro bump detail and the pore detail that we wanted to retain. We did our initial first test when we did our ZBrush sculpts, and we rendered it out. You could see that in some areas it was kind of lacking. So using that tool, we were lucky enough to have that in the beta testing. We were able to really push how much detail we could capture in his stages. And then we have our Lookdev. And again, trying to make something this big and red believable on stage was very tricky. So we really need to make sure we had enough detail, not only in the texture stage and the color pigmentation, but also in the pores, the surfacing, and just make it vast enough so you captured like his true menacing presence. And again, after we had the base color and tone sorted, we had to layer on dust and dirt and rubble just to really, really bring out his true detail. After that, after the model was approved and everything was all final on that stage, we handed it over to our rigging team. And for this, we decided to go over creature effect simulation. So we did a lot of muscle simulation and muscle jiggle, and this required a full CG build of his skeletons, muscles. And then we used a tool called Ziva, which handled all of our dynamics. So after the muscles were simulated, we did a fat layer to make sure we had the jiggle in that. And then after that, we went on to do another skin surface layer, high res as well, to capture all the wrinkles and creases. Then once we put that on stage and put it for our render test, we noticed that on the close-up, some of his facial animation, it was there, all the animation was there, but we just needed that finite detail. So we did another pass on his face to capture the crow's feet, the wrinkles inside the mouth when he smiles and is green. So we really had to push the envelope of creativity for that way. So here was one of our initial tests that we did, one of our head of effects at Milk. We said to him, look, this guy's going to come out of the ground. We need to make something big and massive. So he went away for like a couple of days and came back with this. And we were like, wow, this is amazing. We love it. But again, thinking about what Neil and Douglas really wanted to capture, it was a bit too much. It kind of distracted you from his emergence, because the story was about Satan, not about how he came out of the ground. For us, visually, that's amazing for me and most of you guys, but storytelling-wise, it doesn't really truly capture where we want to go with that. So as I said before, our effects team was pretty big, and on this sequence alone, we ended up having about 7 to 8 people, all working on different layers, all at the same time. So that was anything from like dust and rubble and embers and fire, and really stripping those iterations out and then putting them together for a final play bust inside Houdini. The data exports, as you can see from this, also, this is our final Lookdev. This is our final Lookdev for the look. And again, we showed this to the director, and they were pretty happy with it. And then once it got to this stage, it was a case of stripping back certain layers, choreographing certain rocks, so they didn't cover too much of his expression and what the animators did. And some of the passes and exports that we got from this were probably about 100 gigs to maybe even terabytes, just on exports alone from Houdini. So what we did was did a bunch of VDBs for the smoke, and then we did Arnold stand-ins for the other stuff, like the dynamic stuff, like the rocks and stuff. And then this was handed over to our lighters, and what we soon noticed again was that we were hitting a bottleneck of how much we could actually render locally and what we could actually get out of Maya. So what we did using the cloud, we decided to juggle this around. So we sent certain render layers that were smaller, we kept local, and the bigger ones that took too much time or too much memory, we sent to cloud. And also vice versa. Sometimes we sent the quicker ones to the cloud because we knew they would get chewed up straight away, and the bigger ones we kept here just to make sure that they would get done. So also in conclusion to that, so it's really important for a small studio like Milk to to make pretty much use of the cloud entirely for most shows and nearly all of the VFX that we produce at Milk. And it's a sense to have access to this just because it enables us to take on bigger shows and be the primary vendor. Normally, you probably deal with like one episode for one show and it would go to another vendor and they'll do the episode. But because we had all 6 episodes for the show, making full use of the cloud at any one time was really perfect for this. So what I'm going to do now is hand it over to Benoit, and he's going to talk more about how our pipeline was streamlined and how we really finessed the talking from the cloud and up and down, and from Milk and up into the cloud.
So thank you, Adrian. So I hope that by now you have a pretty good idea of the amount of and the scope of the work we did on Good Omens. And as Adrian was saying, so we used the cloud throughout the entire production. So now I'm going to dive deep into the technical side of it. So in terms of the cloud setup that we have at Milk, so we are connected to AWS through a SONET 10 gig fast lane line. And we're connected through AWS Direct Connect, which means it goes outside of the public internet for added security. In terms of the cloud compute resources, we're relying on AWS EC2, and we are almost exclusively using Spot instances. So what this means is the instances can be interrupted at any time, but they're a lot cheaper. So in our pipeline, we made sure that all our scripts and renderers could handle that and be stopped and resumed without wasting any data. So for us, it's a lot more cost effective. In terms of our local storage, we are using a solution based around GPFS file system developed by Pixit Media. So what it means is that we're using the same file system both locally and in the cloud. So the render nodes in the cloud see exactly the same file system. So we have internally on our local infrastructure, we have a Pixstore server, and then we're starting some Pixcache servers into the cloud, and they basically get in sync with each other. In terms of the farm management, we're relying on a Deadline to manage the farm. So it allows us to keep a unified view of the entire farm, both local and in the cloud. And we're also using something called the Spot Event plugin inside of Deadline. And this plugin allows us to actually, we don't have to deal with the Spot instances directly. We don't have to start them manually. Deadline does that for us, so it automatically handles like ramping up and down of the cloud. In terms of the cloud usage at Milk, we've started to use it 4 years ago. We started a bit small and then like ramped up ever since. And even like since last year, we started to use it on more than one project per year. So we really, now it's becoming really something that's integrated into our everyday workflow. And what you can see as well is we used it on a variety of renderers. So we used it on RenderMan, Arnold, and Mantra. So we're not tied to any renderer. And also what we start to see more is that at the beginning when we were trying to use the cloud, we would use it more like towards the end of the project, like to meet a tight deadline, whereas now we start to use it more throughout the entire production. So if we look at the cloud usage specifically on Good Omens, so as Adrian was saying earlier, we had a short production time of 20 weeks, and we had 6 episodes to deliver during that time. So we basically had 6 different deadlines to work towards. If we look at the cloud usage during these 20 weeks, we can see here that's the number of cores used every day. We can see that we had a constant usage of the cloud throughout the entire production. We even had an early peak at around 83,000 cores early in September, and that was for the first episode delivery. And over the entire production, that's an average of 15,000 cores, which works out at over 200,000 hours of compute time into the cloud. So that's just looking at the cloud, but if we're looking at the amount of work we did in 3D, we both locally and in the cloud, we rendered almost 1 million frames, and out of these, 60% of them were rendered into the cloud. So that really shows that that was an integral part of the entire production. And now if we actually look at the amount of frames rendered per day, So you can see the local in blue and the orange are the cloud. So what we can see is that with just using our local resources, we managed to render around like 5,000, maybe sometimes 10,000 frames per day. But to accommodate for the needs of production like Good Omens, we sometimes need to go farther and like 10, 15 or 20,000 frames rendered per day. And we can see that thanks to the cloud, it basically allows us to do that. Now, if we look at the breakdown per episode, here we have the amount of rendering hours per episode. So we can see that the most work was done in episode 6, 4, and 1. So episode 1, as Adrian was showing, has the wings. Episode 4 has the Kraken, and episode 6 has a bit of the wings and the Satan sequence as well. And what we can also see is that on episode 1, we have more cloud usage on it because it was early in production. So we had to meet like a really tight deadline. And also because the wings required a lot of rendering resources, we had to use more cloud on this. Whereas if we go to episode 6, we start to be able to use more, like to make more use of our local infrastructure. If we actually look at the sequences themselves, if we look at the amount of rendering per sequence, we can see that they all had quite significant rendering requirements, but especially 2 of them really like stand out. And if we look at what they are, these are the wings and the Satan sequences. And the wings, we can actually see that most of it was rendered into the cloud. Whereas Satan, we were able to use a bit more of our local infrastructure. Now, if we look at what happens exactly when we start to do cloud rendering is we actually start an EC2 normal instance, and this instance will stay live throughout the entire show. So what it will do, it will act as a GPFS cache, so a file system cache for the cloud. So we start a GPFS client on it, and we attach 12 terabytes of storage for the cache through 8 NVMe local disks. And then we can start any number of spot instances, and whenever these spot instances need to access the file system, they will actually connect to the cache instead of connecting to our main storage. And we always using the 96 cores spot instances. But what we can see is as we ramp up the production demands and we start to add more and more spot instances, is that the performance of the cache starts to go down. So what we do is we actually start a new cache into the cloud, and we redirect half of the spot instances to use this cache, just to spread the load between the 2 caches. And what we observed is that there's a sweet spot around 170 nodes where the performances are still really good. But if we start to go like around 200 nodes, the performances start to go down. So on a project like Good Omens, we had any number of nodes between 150 and 860. So we oscillated between 1 and 5 caches during the production, really. So that's something that we had to keep an eye on, and that's still a manual process, so we're hoping to improve this and try to automate it a bit more, like ramping up the cache. Another thing that we had to monitor was the bandwidth between the local and the cloud, because we're on a hybrid solution with our storage. All the data has to go through one link. So whenever we're starting to do renders, we have to upload all the assets into the cache, and then we also have to sync back all the rendered images. So really, this single link acts as a bottleneck. So we really have to be careful that it doesn't have any negative impact on the render. So in order to alleviate some of the effects of this bottleneck, we developed a few solutions in our pipeline department. So I won't go into the details exactly of all the customizations we did, because we presented it at SIGGRAPH last year for the project Adrift. So if you want to have a look, it's available on YouTube. And so I'll go over it quickly and then dive into one of them. But here, if we look at the typical workflow, is that we have an export job and a render job both into the cloud, and then we have a post-process job on-prem. And so what we did is adding a number of callbacks using the Deadline Python API. So using the pre-job, pre-task, post-task, all the facilities given by a deadline. So we were able to add a few solutions to alleviate the issues caused by the bottleneck. And now I'm just going to look at the caching of the assets, and if you want more information on the other steps, you can always refer to the other talk. So the cloud caching, the way it was working until the Adrift project was that it was a really manual process. So the artist would indicate which files were needed by their render, and then they would send that to the farm. So now what we're doing is automatically, here if we're looking at the Maya binary scene, automatically we'll recurse into the scene and inspect all the requirements and just list all the files, so Alembic caches, textures, as files, VDB, FX sequences and everything. And we'll compile a list of all the requirements for this job, and we'll send that to Deadline. So Deadline will then be able to pre-cache all the files into the cloud. So now that's done like automatically and in the background for the artists, so they don't have to worry about it. And what we do as well is now we actually computing the file size on disk of all these files, and we also send that to Deadline. And what it allows us is in Deadline Monitor, which is the interface we're using to manage the farm. We're able to show that cache size directly into the interface. So anyone who's wrangling the farm would be able to see that information. So for instance, if we had 4 jobs into the queue, which would be a very, very quiet day, but we're able to directly see like which job has the like small or big caches. So in this case, for instance, we would be able to quickly identify 2 of the jobs which have really small caches. So they would take like a few seconds or a few minutes to upload to the cloud. So they would be really good candidates to send to the cloud. And if we look at the one at the bottom with almost 2 terabytes of data, that's a huge shot. So probably a lot of FX caches and maybe a 1,000 frame long shot. So this job might take a few hours to actually upload to the cloud, and it might have also a negative impact on all the other traffic. So if you're trying to put 10 jobs like that wouldn't really go well. So we need to be careful and identify these jobs. And what we'll do is probably we will try to render it locally, or maybe we'll wait and render it overnight onto the cloud, or during a weekend, but we will be careful because there's so much data on this one. Something else that we had to keep an eye on were cloud resources. So we developed a few like solutions around it, and one of them was we have a daily export from Deadline to a spreadsheet that then gets automatically sent to the finance department and production. So everyone can keep an eye on the cost, the current cost, and make sure everything stays on budget. Because each project has its own cloud budget, and everyone needs to be careful to stay in line. Another thing, which is not really technical, but we had to make sure that we were doing regular catch-ups. So between production, supervisor, the pipeline and systems team, just to identify the cloud requirements, the cloud budget of every project, and make sure everyone was fully aware of what was coming down the pipeline really. So I hope you had a good overview of the work we did on Good Omens and how we used the cloud. And now I think we have some time for some questions. Um,
The details of how do you partition a work?
I think, I mean, it depends on a lot of factors. I mean, if it's a shot that, for instance, we want to show to the client tomorrow and there's 500 frames and it's the wings which are quite heavy to render, then we would identify this job as going to the cloud, but it's a decision with production based on the client requirements, deadlines, previous render times, the size of the job. So there's no magic
there's a number
rule.
of things that we have to factor in on that side of things. That's all. It's per request and per job.
And also because on the cloud we are able to use 96 cores nodes, which we don't have locally actually. I think we have up to 64 cores. So actually sometimes it's even the artists prefer to push more things to the cloud.
We'd get requests that would say, can I send this to the cloud to get feedback straight away? And we'd be like, all right, quickly. One of those things.
And also, the nodes have almost 400 gig of RAM into the cloud, which is a lot more than what we have locally, so that really helps. And as we go from one project to another, the performances, the specs of the nodes are better and better each year, whereas our local infrastructure is getting a bit older, so we're trying to select.
Do you have any software VFX which only runs on Mac and because of which you cannot support it? Do you run into this situation?
Sorry, what was the question?
Some softwares which are only available on Mac used by VFX artists. How do you, and because this cloud-based solution is only for Linux and Windows, how do you satisfy the needs for such artists who wants to work with Mac-based solutions?
We don't have any. I mean, we have some artists using Macs, mostly in DMP.
Yeah.
Some of them are using Cinema 4D, but then they're able to use the Cinema 4D to Arnold bridge, the plugin C4D2A. So we actually export a NAS sequence from Cinema 4D, and then we're able to render that into our Linux render farm. And that's otherwise it's Photoshop work, which we don't need to render on the cloud, really.
Hi, I noticed that you mentioned that you use Maya binary files.
Mm-hmm.
I've always had it recommended to use ASCII files so that you get the text information preserved in case something corrupt happens. You can go in and fix it. Is there a reason that you use binaries?
I think it's more of a case of just how big the Maya files we're getting.
Yeah.
And to go through and sit through and think, well, you need to program and take out bits of strip out certain types of things to make the scene work is kind of something that we don't do often. Normally we just have a Maya file and that works, and playing with ASCII files is kind of unknown territory in that sense of things.
I think the file size will be a lot smaller in Maya binary, and we never really had like any corrupted files, like Maya files. Or,
that we know. I know in past projects we have certain times where we have gone into the Maya ASCII file and stripped out stuff, but it's very rare occurrence.
It's more for debugging, I would say.
Yeah.
Sometimes we have to save as Maya ASCII just to inspect the file and.
I was wondering, have you guys used the cloud for working, not just rendering, and what have you thought about in the future, especially with effects and Houdini and kind of distributing settings maybe or something like that? I don't know what's possible.
We did some tests with workstations into the cloud, and that's really something that we're trying to push towards too. But we're not yet using the workstations into the cloud in production, so we're more at the testing phase at the moment. One issue we have is because we are in this hybrid stage where we have some, like our local storage, I mean, we have everything on-prem, and it would mean like pushing a lot more data to the cloud and keeping the data there. So we have to figure out the best way to do that. Maybe we'll like select one project and then we'll start to do workstations there just for that project. And
And in terms of simulation-wise, we kind of keep our sims local, just so we can monitor it a bit more and we know exactly, well, if it's going to go on our fast boxes, we know that it's going to handle that. if we send it to the cloud, we can get probably unknown results. So we haven't really tested. We can test it, but I think we were looking into it later on. But for now, we tend to keep all of our sims local, just so it's easy for easy use.
But yeah, if we were doing everything into the cloud, then we would be able to do the sims and leave the data there and not retrieve it. But it means all the pipeline, all the artists have to be in the cloud. So there's this gap. Like, how do you go from one to the other?
Yeah.
So that's why, I was saying maybe we'll identify one project, and this project will be entirely in the cloud. But it means if one department, is not able to use it, then we have to find a way.
Was Soho Net already at your guys' building, or is that something that you had?
Sorry?
Your guys' connection, your AWS Direct Connect, was Soho Net already at your building, or was that something that you guys had to get installed?
We already had a SONET connection for our normal internet connection. So that was quite easy to add the fast lane direct connect. Yeah.
And then my other question would be, are all your renders submitted on-prem? If you had a worker that was working remotely for a week or a month, is he able to have a workstation at home and submit to the cloud or submit to?
So the way we would do that is we would send a TRDC box to the artist, so they would connect to our local infrastructure, and then they would just send to the cloud normally.
Yeah, as if they were here in that building.
But if we were to use a workstation to the cloud, they would potentially be able to directly see the workstation at home just by connecting to the correct cloud.
There was a mention of tweaking the render scene for the cloud. Like, what kind of tweaks you need to do?
So what we were doing, I think that was especially on the Mantra jobs, we were tweaking the location of the checkpoints, because what we were seeing is that because the file system stays in sync between on-prem and the cloud, and the rendered images are coming back, and we want them, but we don't necessarily want to retrieve the checkpoints from the cloud, because that Mantra keeps writing to the file, so the file system detects the changes and sends them back. So you have a lot of traffic, which is just the checkpoints being updated. So what we decided is we have a location on the file system in the cloud that's not synced to the local storage. So we are still able to do checkpointing, because if the node gets interrupted and another one starts, it will still see this location into the cloud, but the data doesn't come back. So what we're doing is dynamically, if the render is in the cloud, we edit the scene just to change the location of the checkpoints. And we might be able to do some other tweaks as well if we needed to. Yeah.
How do you guys deal with color management throughout the whole pipeline? Do you guys have to re-render things? Does it go to a colorist? Like, how does that work with your whole pipeline?
Usually we have a quite in-depth spec from the client at the beginning of the show.
We get a brief and of what we need to produce and what they want to require. So we kind of set up on our end first to make sure that's stable, and that's the borderline for us, and then everything else is we just meet into that borderline each time.
So at the beginning of every project, we do a setup. We set up the color pipeline. Then we receive some test plates or the turnover plates, and we make them go through the entire pipeline without adding any CG. And then we send them back to the client. They check that everything is exactly what they want, and then we're good to go.
Sorry.
In terms of a financial burden, is it more towards the compute, or is it pulling the data back down with you guys?
Compute, yeah. Yes, the storage cost is quite minimal, actually, compared to the compute. And also, you don't pay for any data you upload. You just pay for data that you're bringing back. Yeah.
No questions?
All good?
Nope. Cool.
Okay, yeah.
Well, thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
for, yeah.